Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. When I opened the door, I was met with the house's hollow silence. An unusual sense of calm hung in the air until the quiet was shattered by an argument coming from the living room. I paused in the hallway, holding my breath, and heard Alex raise his voice. "I didn't ask you to come here," he said harshly. "You have your own life, Nathan, and you'd better focus on it." "Oh, really?" responded a voice that I realized belonged to Nathan, his son from his first marriage. The voice was filled with sarcasm and a hint of hidden pain. "Are you saying I don't belong here?" "I get it. Same as always." Nathan sighed, and it seemed to carry such disappointment that I felt a pang in my chest. I'd never met him until now, though Alex had told me about his achievements and independence. But in his voice now, there wasn't a trace of confidence, only wounded pride. "It's time you grew up and stopped playing the victim," Alex snapped. "Not everything can be solved by blaming others and throwing tantrums." "Fine, I get it," Nathan replied, his tone cold and filled with resentment. "But don't tell me how to live my life. You lost that right long ago." I felt the air grow sharper, as if right after a storm. Before I could understand what it all meant, the door suddenly swung open. Nathan stepped into the hallway, and our eyes met. I felt like an outsider in their conflict, but Nathan's gaze lingered on me a moment longer than necessary, as though he wanted to say something but thought better of it. His face held a mix of anger and disappointment. He gave me a brief nod, and without a word, walked past me toward the exit. The door closed behind him with a dull thud, leaving me standing in uncertainty. I glanced at Alex, who remained in the room. His face was stony, but in his eyes, I saw something that looked like despair. This was a side of Alex I hadn't known. Alex, who, it seemed, was in pain but concealed it behind an unbreakable facade. I stepped cautiously into the living room, feeling like my footsteps echoed too loudly in the vast, empty house. It seemed even bigger and colder when it was just the two of us left inside. "Is everything okay?" I asked softly, trying not to let my voice sound overly concerned. Alex smirked, but there was no trace of humor in his gaze. "Yeah, of course," he answered dryly, as though such arguments were routine for him. "Nathan has always been stubborn, thinks the world revolves around him." I nodded, unsure of what else to say, but my thoughts were muddled. Why had he never told me that their relationship was this strained? In his stories, Nathan had always come across as a confident, independent young man. But now I saw someone vulnerable and seemingly deeply disappointed. "Sorry you had to witness that," Alex added after a short pause, though his voice sounded distant. I didn't respond, only let my eyes wander around the room. This house was filled with remnants of Alex's past life, traces of his previous marriage, and although he had tried to give it a modern look for our new beginning, I'd always felt like an outsider here. I just, I started, trying to find the right words, but then fell silent. The feeling of alienation was growing in me, like an invisible wall separating me from Alex's life. He met my gaze, but his look was cold, as if he didn't want me to be part of this issue. "Laura, you don't need to involve yourself in this," he said firmly, reading my thoughts. "This is my business, my family issues." I felt something break inside me. He was pushing me away, as if I were a stranger, a mere spectator in his life. I lowered my gaze to hide how much his words hurt. "I understand, Alex, but I'm your wife. You can share things with me." "I know," he replied, but there was no warmth, no sincerity in his voice. He seemed like a completely different person to me. That evening, left alone, I sat on the couch, mulling over what I had witnessed today. Nathan's image, leaving the house, was stuck in my mind. His expression, the hidden disappointment that echoed in his words, all of it had settled within me more deeply than I'd expected. Suddenly, I felt as though there was something more hidden in this family, something beyond mere strained relations between father and son. Nathan's face remained in my mind, and I couldn't understand why it left me feeling so disturbed. Several days passed, but the image of Nathan and his tense conversation with Alex wouldn't leave my mind. Alex barely touched on the subject, as if nothing had happened. We slipped back into our usual routine, where every morning began with a brief exchange of phrases, as if rehearsed by heart. All I had to hold on to were small excursions into town, where I could momentarily distract myself from thoughts about that evening's argument. That day, I went to a small cafe near our home, the place I usually went when I wanted to be alone. I ordered a coffee and settled by the window, lost in thought. Suddenly, I felt a presence nearby. Turning my head, I saw Nathan entering the cafe. His gaze found me almost immediately, and a look of recognition flashed in his eyes. He smiled slightly, as if he hadn't expected to see me there, and walked over to my table. "Hi," he said, stepping closer. "Do you mind if I join you?" I nodded, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. The unexpected coincidence felt strange, but I decided not to dwell on it. We both acted as though everything was completely ordinary. "How are you?" I asked, breaking the awkward silence. "Fine," he replied, his tone casual, though I noticed he glanced away for a moment. "Sorry about that night. I'm sure it looked awkward." I shook my head, sensing the need to find the right words. "You don't need to apologize. We all have moments where we want to say something but can't quite get it out," I said, trying not to appear too interested. He looked at me with gratitude, and I noticed something new in his eyes, a slight openness that wasn't there during our first encounter. "I always feel it's hard to find common ground with my father," he admitted. "We're so different. He's always been busy with his business, and I grew up with my mother. I think you understand." I nodded, surprised by how quickly our conversation had become so candid. "Alex, he's a wonderful person, but sometimes I feel like an outsider in that house," I said, not knowing why I felt compelled to share such honesty with Nathan. "I guess it's natural when you start living in someone else's family." Nathan listened intently, as if absorbing each word, pondering its meaning. "You know, sometimes I feel like a stranger in this family too," he said quietly. "Maybe neither of us truly belongs here." Nathan's words felt so genuine that I felt a strange sense of connection with him. We sat in silence, looking at each other, and I sensed a tension growing between us that hadn't been there before. Before I could understand what I was doing, I leaned toward him. Our lips met unexpectedly, as though it was a moment we'd both longed to experience, but hadn't realized until now. We pulled back quickly, aware that we had just crossed a line. "Laura," Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible. "That was—" "I know," I replied, trying to hide my confusion. "We shouldn't. It's better if we don't do this." He nodded, his gaze filled with the same mixture of feelings I felt: confusion, doubt, and something indescribable. We both knew we couldn't allow this incident to happen again, but words felt unnecessary. It was clear to both of us that this had to remain our secret, something fleeting that was better left forgotten. "Let's just forget about it," Nathan suggested, looking away. "It doesn't mean anything. It's just an accident." I nodded, though everything inside me screamed the opposite. We decided to go our separate ways, each in a different direction, and not to discuss what had happened again. In the evening, Alex decided to celebrate his business success with a dinner at an upscale restaurant. This was a special occasion for him. A major contract he had been working on for months was finally signed. I understood how important this was for him and tried to share in his joy, even though my mind was preoccupied with entirely different thoughts. When he suggested inviting Nathan to dinner, I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. After our last encounter with Nathan, I had been avoiding thinking about what happened, but the thought of us all sitting at the same table made me feel a faint sense of unease that seemed impossible to hide. We met at the restaurant, a place chosen with subtle elegance, as if to underline Alex's success. Nathan, as usual, was a few minutes late, and Alex and I were already waiting at a table by the window when he walked in. I immediately noticed that his gaze lingered on me before he took a seat across from us. There was restraint in his eyes, but something else too, either worry or regret. It was impossible to tell. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said, trying to appear nonchalant. "No problem at all," Alex replied with a broad smile. He was in great spirits, and it helped ease the situation. I hoped his enthusiasm would help dispel the awkwardness. Alex began talking about his new project with the excitement he only showed in moments like these. He described the partners he had secured, the plans for development, and the company's future prospects. I listened, nodding and murmuring in agreement, though out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that Nathan seemed absent. He silently twirled his glass in his hands, looking at it as if it held all the answers to his questions. "Well, what do you think of our plan?" Alex asked Nathan, hoping for at least a polite endorsement. Nathan startled slightly, raised his gaze, and simply replied, "It's a great plan, Dad. I'm happy for you." But there was no genuine joy in his tone, only a certain tension. I saw that Alex noticed it too, but chose not to make anything of it. He continued talking, as if wanting to catch up on all the conversations they hadn't had over the years. I tried to focus on their exchange, but emotions surged over me in waves: guilt for my closeness with Nathan, and a strange feeling of attraction I didn't want to acknowledge. Throughout dinner, Nathan barely glanced in my direction. He deliberately avoided me, responding briefly when Alex asked questions, and was deeply immersed in his thoughts. His behavior only amplified my confusion and discomfort. When Alex excused himself for a moment, I decided to take a risk and speak to Nathan, hoping to restore some sense of balance in our relationship. "Nathan, I," I began, searching for the right words. He looked at me, his eyes cold and distant, as though there was nothing left between us. "Don't, Laura!" He cut me off quietly but firmly. "It's better to just forget." His words felt like an icy sting, and I felt a shiver run through me. I lowered my gaze, understanding that he didn't want to talk, didn't want me near him. His refusal and his distance stirred up a silent protest in me, mixed with a guilt I couldn't shake off. When Alex returned, he was once again full of enthusiasm, and I tried to hide my inner turmoil, hoping he wouldn't notice the tense silence between us. But inside, I felt as if Nathan's every gesture, his cold gaze, and his restrained demeanor were tearing me apart. Dinner finally ended, and we stood up from the table. Alex wrapped his arm around me, oblivious to how tense I'd been all evening. He suggested Nathan come home with us to toast to his success, but Nathan declined, citing fatigue and the need to return to his own affairs. As we said goodbye outside the restaurant, I caught his gaze one last time. It was cold and detached, signaling that our incident in the cafe was nothing more than a mistake in his eyes, something that shouldn't happen again. On the way home, I sat in the car silently, listening to Alex go on about the future, but I could barely hear him. All my thoughts were consumed by what Nathan's behavior meant and why I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered after that dinner. A few days had passed since that tense dinner, and it finally seemed like the awkwardness hanging in the air had begun to dissipate. I immersed myself in my usual duties, trying not to think about the incident in the cafe and Nathan's subsequent refusal. Alex was busy, absorbed in his new project, which, in some way, brought me a sense of relief. One evening, stepping out onto the terrace behind the house to get some fresh air, I saw Nathan standing by the railing. He was looking off into the distance, seemingly troubled by something deep within. I approached him, feeling a strange stir within myself at his presence. "Hi," I said, cautiously standing beside him. He didn't turn his head, only gave a brief nod. "Hi, Laura," he replied, and his tone was distant, as if he wasn't particularly pleased to see me here. We stood in silence for a few minutes, watching the evening light slowly fade over the horizon. Finally, I gathered the courage to speak, trying to break the heavy silence. "I'm sorry about that evening. Maybe I shouldn't have tried to talk," I stammered, struggling to find the right words. Nathan finally turned to me, his eyes cold and piercing. "You're always apologizing, Laura," he said sharply, not hiding his displeasure. "Always acting as if everything's under control, as if your perfect marriage can fix everything. But do you actually believe that?" His words struck me like a blow. I took a step back, lost for words. His tone was harsh, yet there was a truth in his words I had been avoiding for a long time. I I'm just trying to do what's right," I whispered, feeling a lump forming in my throat. "You don't understand." "No, I don't," he replied with irony in his voice. "I don't understand how someone can build a relationship on lies. You want to keep a family with someone you can't even be honest with, not even with yourself." "Don't talk to me like that," I snapped, trying to keep my emotions in check, but I felt myself losing control. "Do you think it's easy for me? Do you think I don't feel lost in all of this?" Nathan looked at me for a long time, and his cold gaze seemed to soften. He sighed, as if he'd finally decided to listen to me. "If it's so hard, why are you still here? Why keep playing this game?" he asked quietly, with a sincerity in his voice that went beyond mere judgment. I couldn't hold back anymore. Words I'd kept locked inside me for so long were spilling out. "Because I don't know what to do," I breathed. "I feel like a stranger in this house, in this relationship. Alex, he's kind, caring, but I just don't feel alive when I'm with him." I looked away, afraid of what I might see in Nathan's reaction, but he remained silent, listening. I continued, feeling more vulnerable with every word. I tried to convince myself that stability is more important, that over time things would get better, that I'd get used to this new life. But this feeling, this emptiness inside, it doesn't go away. I looked at him, and in his eyes, I saw something akin to understanding. He nodded slowly, as if my words confirmed his own suspicions. "You know, I see how hard you try to act like everything's fine," he said gently, his earlier reproach gone. "But sometimes, it's important to admit when things aren't right. Otherwise, you just keep pretending instead of making a change." Silence settled between us. I felt our conversation had reached a depth from which there was no turning back. Yet, at the same time, I realized that Nathan's words had touched the very core of me, striking the part of my soul I'd ignored for so long. Nathan moved closer to me, and I felt a gentle warmth radiating from his presence. We looked at each other, and in that moment, I realized that our connection ran far deeper than I'd allowed myself to believe. This wasn't just a physical attraction. It was an understanding, hidden in every glance, in every word. I didn't know what to do next. We both knew this forbidden attraction couldn't end well, yet I was finding it harder and harder to restrain my feelings. When Alex suggested going to our country house for the weekend, a wave of unease sparked within me. A long weekend away from everything, in a place where there's nowhere to hide, where every step is under close scrutiny. I realized this was a test, one I wished I could avoid. "Laura, we need this," Alex insisted, when I subtly hinted that I could stay behind, using work as an excuse. "We haven't had time to be together for a while, and I want us to spend it as a family." The word family stirred something strange in my heart. I wanted to be a family for Alex, but the feeling of detachment was growing stronger with each passing day. And, most importantly, how would I handle being around Nathan? But saying no wasn't an option, and a few days later, we were driving down narrow country roads. The house was beautiful, surrounded by greenery and flowers, but a sense of anxiety grew inside me. Everything felt too perfect. The calm lake, the silence, the isolation from the world. I felt the tension between the three of us intensifying with every moment. From the first evening, minor frictions arose. Alex, excited by his plans, tried to engage Nathan in conversations about business and his future. However, Nathan, clearly not sharing his father's enthusiasm, responded briefly and with evident irritation. Each time Alex attempted to start a discussion, an awkward silence would fill the space. I just want you to be more responsible, Nathan, Alex said at dinner, once again steering the conversation toward his son's future career. Can you stop? Nathan retorted sharply, setting his utensils down with a loud clatter. You can't force me to be someone I don't want to be. I tried to smooth things over, but every glance Nathan threw in my direction only deepened my inner turmoil. It seemed like Alex was oblivious to the invisible wall standing between us. He simply continued to act as if this weekend was a wonderful opportunity for us all to restore a lost sense of harmony. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, broken only by the sounds of the forest and the whisper of the wind. At some point, I got out of bed, put on a jacket, and stepped outside. I needed a moment alone to sort through my thoughts. I walked along the path, breathing in the cool night air, when I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Nathan approaching. Laura, you're not sleeping? His voice was soft, but I sensed a strange tension in it. Just couldn't fall asleep, I replied, trying to remain calm. And you? He stopped beside me, his gaze fixed on the dark line of the lake ahead. There are too many thoughts here to sleep, he said, staring into the distance. Sometimes, it feels like all we're doing is just pretending that everything's fine. I stayed silent because I couldn't disagree. His words, like a thin thread, wove into my own thoughts, my own doubts. We stood side by side, and I felt an invisible tension between us becoming almost tangible. Why don't you just tell your father that you don't need any of this? I finally asked, deciding to shift the conversation to safer ground. Because it's not that simple, Nathan replied. Or maybe I just enjoy watching him pretend he's in control. I felt our words were just the tip of the iceberg, concealing much more beneath, but I didn't know how to voice what was on my mind. I must have hurt him with my questions again, yet I couldn't shake the desire to hear more from him. Laura, he finally murmured softly, and something inside me broke at the vulnerability in his tone. You're unhappy too, aren't you? His words hung in the air, and I could no longer hold back my pain. I don't know. I lowered my gaze, trying to hide the tears that were threatening to spill. At some point, I realized I don't feel like myself anymore. And now, I'm just scared. Scared to admit that maybe I'm making a mistake. Scared to admit that something's missing. He said nothing, but his gaze spoke louder than any words. I felt him reach out, his hand brushing against mine, a gesture that was both simple and weighty, as if it held more than we wanted to admit. In that moment, there was a strange closeness I couldn't refuse. I knew our feelings were becoming dangerous, but I couldn't stop. When Alex announced he needed to go into town for the day, I felt both relief and anxiety. Staying alone with Nathan at the country house meant facing emotions that were becoming increasingly uncontrollable. I spent the morning trying to keep my distance, busying myself with household tasks. Yet, I could never shake the feeling of his presence. In the evening, as the sun was setting, I stepped out onto the terrace to enjoy the last rays of daylight and, perhaps, clear my thoughts. But as soon as I walked out, I saw Nathan standing by the railing. He looked up, and in his eyes, I saw the same shadow of doubt and desire I felt within myself. It's quiet tonight, he said, as if that could explain my sudden appearance. Yes, I replied, feeling my words hang in the air between us, unable to ease the tension. Sometimes silence says too much. We both fell silent, lost in our own thoughts. Then he turned to me, and his voice was unexpectedly serious. Laura, are you happy? He asked, a flicker of concern in his eyes. I mean it. I hadn't expected that question, though perhaps it was only natural. I sighed, unsure how to respond. I don't know, Nathan, I answered honestly. Sometimes it feels like I've lost myself. I got married thinking that stability and care would solve everything, but instead, I feel empty, like I'm living someone else's life, like each day is just a step into nowhere. He kept his gaze on me, and I saw understanding in his eyes. Understanding and something more. Something that made me feel on edge, as if everything I'd been trying to suppress was about to surface. I know what it's like to be with someone and feel alone, he whispered, and his words sounded like a quiet confession. Maybe that's what binds us. I looked at him, unable to look away. Our words were honest, but they only deepened the connection I was trying to ignore. I knew it was wrong, that this emotional closeness threatened everything I had tried to build with Alex. But the pull was stronger than I was. At some point, he took a step toward me, and I didn't move away. I felt his hand gently touch mine, his gaze lingering on my lips. An intense, almost painful desire flared up inside me, and I could no longer hold back. Our kiss was soft, but deeper and more intense than the one that had happened back at the cafe. This time, we both knew what we were doing, and that awareness made everything even more thrilling and frightening. I felt his warmth, his touch, and it filled me with a strange energy that was hard to resist. We both understood that this wasn't just an accident or a mistake, that real feelings were behind it. But with that understanding also came the realization that this couldn't be. This moment, however desired, shattered everything I had tried to build. A growing awareness inside me told me this couldn't go on. I pulled away abruptly, struggling to regain my composure, and whispered, I can't. I need to figure things out. I need to make a choice. Nathan didn't try to hold me back. He just nodded, understanding that this moment had marked a boundary, beyond which lay far too much. Returning home from the countryside was unsettling. The car was filled with tense silence, and Alex glanced at me several times, as if trying to understand something. I knew this would happen sooner or later. His suspicions were inevitable. I could be present physically, but my thoughts were far away. Is everything all right, Laura? Alex asked in a gentle tone, trying not to scare me. But I noticed the tension in his gaze that he was attempting to hide. Yes, of course, I replied with a forced smile, keeping my gaze fixed on the window. Just a little tired, that's all. Alex nodded, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied. His look grew even more intense, and at some point, I could almost feel his suspicions as something tangible. Not knowing what to say, I sank deeper into silence, hoping this conversation would end on its own. When we finally got home, I tried to avoid both Alex and Nathan. I felt like I was on the edge, and any extra word or gesture could destroy everything. I immersed myself in routine tasks, desperately trying to distract myself, but thoughts of Nathan haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling of closeness I'd experienced on the terrace, and realized things had become far more complicated than just a fleeting attraction. Nathan, it seemed, had noticed my distance too. A day after our return, I received a message from him. The phone screen lit up with his name, and even without opening it, I knew he wanted to meet. The message was simple: we need to talk. I stared at the screen for a long time, torn between the urge to respond and the fear of what might happen. But in the end, I simply closed my phone and put it away. Responding would mean admitting my feelings for him were real, that I could no longer ignore them. But I was afraid to take that step, afraid of destroying what Alex and I still had. Every time Alex walked past, I felt his tense gaze, as if he sensed something was going on, something important that I was hiding from him. This made me feel even more distant, and each day I withdrew further, avoiding both encounters with Nathan and conversations with Alex. The next day, when I returned home after a brief walk, Nathan was already waiting for me in the living room. He stood up when I entered, his face tense, and determination burned in his eyes. It was clear that ignoring his message the day before hadn't gone unnoticed. "We need to talk, Laura," he said, his voice firm, but I could also hear the hurt in it. I felt a tightness inside me. We had reached a point where there was no turning back. I didn't know how to explain my feelings, how to justify what was happening between us, but I couldn't let him see my doubts. "About what?" I replied coolly, trying to appear calm. "About what happened on the terrace. That was a mistake, Nathan. We shouldn't have let it happen." He frowned. His gaze grew heavier. "A mistake?" he repeated, disappointment coloring his voice. "Do you really think it was just a mistake? Laura, you feel it too. You know there's something more between us than just a passing fancy." Nathan's words crashed over me like a wave, forcing me to admit what I'd been stubbornly trying to deny. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew he was right. These feelings were tearing my inner peace apart, yet I couldn't shake them. I turned away, not knowing how to explain the struggle that was tearing me up inside. "I can't just throw away everything I have, Nathan," I said, my voice trembling with mixed emotions. "I have Alex. We have a family, even if it's not perfect, but I just can't do this to him." Nathan took a step closer, his eyes softening, almost pleading. "Laura, you know this is more than just family." His voice was quiet, but filled with resolve. "We're both unhappy, living lives that bring no joy, and I can't just turn a blind eye to what I feel." I didn't know how to respond. For a moment, I wanted to disappear, to escape this tangled reality, but it held me fast. At that moment, Alex walked into the room. He paused, looking at both of us, then smiled gently as if he hadn't noticed the tension. "Such a gloomy mood," he said, trying to lighten the atmosphere. "I thought maybe we all need to relax a bit. What do you think about a family dinner tonight? It's been a while since we all sat down together." His suggestion caught me off guard. I exchanged a quick glance with Nathan, but his face remained impassive. He understood that we couldn't openly oppose Alex's idea, and that our tension couldn't be allowed to become obvious. "That's a great idea, Alex," I replied, trying to mask my nerves. "I think it would be good for all of us." Alex smiled, his gaze lingering on me a second longer than usual, as though he was trying to figure out what was happening. After the tense dinner, I realized I could no longer live in this constant inner conflict. My attachment to Nathan was slowly unraveling my life, and it had become nearly unbearable. I felt as if I were balancing on a knife's edge, where any awkward move, look, or word could put everything at risk. Though Alex hadn't said anything outright, he had started to notice something was amiss, which only amplified my anxiety. I decided to meet with Nathan and talk. I needed to explain my decision and try to close this chapter. We agreed to meet that evening at a quiet cafe nearby, where we wouldn't be seen. When he arrived, his face was serious, but there was a subtle sadness in his eyes. "You look tense, Laura," he said, sitting across from me, studying me intently. I gathered all my strength to keep my voice steady. "Nathan, we need to stop this," I said firmly, though everything inside me was trembling. "I can't go on. If we continue, it'll destroy everything I have with Alex. And more." He looked at me silently, but I noticed the tension in the line of his mouth. Pain flickered in his eyes, yet he didn't argue. He simply nodded slightly, reluctantly accepting my decision. "I understand," he said quietly. "But you need to know that I can't forget you, Laura. What happened between us? It's not just a fleeting attraction for me." His words hit deep, and I felt my heart clench. He was right. This wasn't just a whim, it was something far more profound. Our eyes met, and I realized that, despite my resolution, breaking this connection would be much harder than I'd anticipated. We sat in silence, understanding that there was nothing left to say. An invisible thread seemed to bind our lives and emotions, and now severing it felt impossible. I felt his hand brush lightly against mine, a gesture that seemed to draw a line under our conversation, leaving unresolved tension between us. When I got home, I tried to remain composed and calm, concealing the turmoil inside. Alex didn't seem to notice my state, but there was something scrutinizing in his gaze, as if he suspected something. The next day, as I prepared to leave, he entered the room with a strange expression on his face. Yet he said nothing. It wasn't until later that I realized he'd begun to suspect me. At that moment, I hadn't known he'd decided to check my phone, and, accidentally stumbling upon an undeleted message from Nathan, found his first hint that I might be having secret meetings. Since Alex found that message, there was something new in his eyes, a hidden suspicion, cold and distant. He said nothing directly, but I noticed how he became more attentive to the details, to every move I made, as if he were searching for confirmation of his suspicions. This tension at home grew, and every time he asked me questions, I felt the ground beneath me becoming more unstable. "Laura, are you all right?" he asked one morning over breakfast, his voice calm, though tension flickered in his eyes. I looked at him, attempting to keep my expression as casual as possible. "Yes, of course," I replied, trying not to give myself away. "Why do you ask?" "You just seem a little distant lately." His gaze was intense, and I felt as though any careless word could destroy everything. "I think it's just work and fatigue," I said, shrugging. "Nothing special." Alex nodded silently, but I saw that his suspicions only deepened. He began asking questions more often, and each time I found new evasive answers, trying to maintain balance, yet knowing that this couldn't go on forever. At the same time, Nathan decided to leave town. He sent me a short message, making it clear he wanted to cut ties to avoid further complications and give us both a chance to return to a normal life. I knew it was the right decision, but the thought of him leaving left a bitter feeling of loss. Before he left me a note, unable to give it to me in person. It was brief, but every word resonated with my own feelings. He wrote that, despite everything, it was important to him to keep what we had, at least as a memory. He apologized and thanked me for coming into his life, even if only for a short time. I tucked the note inside my book, deciding I'd find time to read it again later. But fate had other plans. Alex found the note. I knew it by the tense expression on his face and the cold look in his eyes as he entered the room with the sheet of paper in his hand. His silence was deafening, and despite all my attempts to remain calm, my heart pounded in my chest with dread. I was returning home late in the evening when I found Alex sitting on the couch in the dim light. It seemed as though he had been waiting for me, his posture frozen and tense, filling me with unease. There was something unsettling in the air, something oppressive, as if I'd crossed a line with no way back. My heart started to race as I noticed a folded piece of paper in his hands. "Laura," he began quietly but firmly, lifting his gaze to meet mine. "Explain this." He unfolded the paper and held it out to me, but I didn't need to see it to know what it was. I already knew what he held in his hands, and the realization made my insides go cold. It was the note Nathan had left me before leaving. I had hidden it, never thinking Alex would find it. But now, seeing the tension on his face, I knew no explanation would suffice. "What does this mean, Laura?" His voice was barely restrained, but the usual calm and confidence in his eyes had been replaced with hurt and confusion. I remained silent, feeling a wave of panic building inside me. My mind desperately searched for words, but in that moment, I felt as though I had forgotten how to speak. Everything we had tried to keep hidden had now come to the surface, and there was no longer any escape. "I'm waiting, Laura." His voice softened, but this only made it more terrifying. "Did you have a relationship with Nathan?" He asked the direct question, one I could no longer avoid. His words cut through me like icy needles, and I realized I could no longer deflect, that any answer or lie would only deepen his pain. My mind scrambled for explanations, but any words felt pitiful and useless. Alex? I exhaled, feeling a lump forming in my throat. I. It's complicated to explain. Try, he interrupted, his voice shaking, and I could see how hard he was trying to hold himself together. Explain how this could happen? You know how much I trusted you. You know how hard I tried for us. I never thought you were capable of this. I lowered my gaze, unable to withstand his intense, hurt-filled stare. For months, I had tried to justify it to myself, convincing myself that my attraction to Nathan was just a fleeting infatuation, that it didn't affect my marriage with Alex. But now, standing in front of him, I realized how deeply I had deceived myself. Everything we had done had hurt not only him, but also me. I began, but again, the words wouldn't come. It's not what you think, Alex. I I didn't mean for it to go this far. He smirked, but there was no amusement in it, only bitterness and disappointment. Go this far? He repeated, his tone harsh. You speak as if this was an accident, as if it were just a mistake. Alex threw the note on the table, as if it had burned his hands. Laura, I thought you were the one person I could trust more than anyone in the world. I thought we had something real, something strong. You are my wife, the mother of my future child. Did you think about that while you were betraying me? I jerked my head up, his words cutting through me like a blow. I'm sorry, I managed, knowing how weak and pathetic those words sounded. But there was nothing else I could say. Sorry. Sorry for shattering his faith, for letting my feelings stray. In that moment, I realized that my guilt could neither be forgiven nor undone. Alex stood silently, as if gathering his thoughts, and in his eyes, I saw a mix of disappointment and pain. It seemed that every wall he had built around himself to protect his heart had suddenly crumbled. He ran a hand over his face, closing his eyes, as though trying to erase from his mind what he had just learned. Do you even understand what you've done? He looked at me again, his gaze filled with despair. You've betrayed everything we had, and worst of all, you did it with my son. How could you? I felt tears welling up, but I refused to let them fall. All I could do now was admit my mistakes, realizing that my lies, my desire, which I had so long justified, had led us to this moment. Alex sighed, as if he no longer had the strength to fight himself. He looked up, his gaze filled with disappointment and a sorrow so deep it seemed to consume everything. I need time, Laura. Time to figure out what to do next. But right now, I can't be near you. He turned and headed to the door, leaving me in the silence of our home, submerged in my own turmoil. The door closed behind him, and I stood there alone, unable to move, unable to breathe. The house was cloaked in a haunting silence. Without Alex, its spacious rooms felt even larger, emptier. I sat on the couch, feeling an expanding void within me, filling the space around me. The thought that I had brought us to this point burned from the inside, like a painful, blinding light, exposing everything I had tried to hide from myself and others. My actions had destroyed the family I was once willing to do anything for. Everything I had built with Alex now seemed fragile and illusory. I thought I would find solace in this marriage, that stability and care would bring me peace. But the truth was different. My attempt to find calm had only led to destruction, loss of trust, loss of self, and a break that could no longer be mended. Alex was gone, leaving me alone with my mistakes and pain in this empty, lifeless house that now felt alien. The sound of a notification shattered the silence, and I instinctively reached for my phone. Nathan's name appeared on the screen. My heart quickened, but this time not with excitement. There was only a strange feeling that this message symbolized a past I needed to let go of. I stared at the screen, not opening it, knowing that the words he had left would only add to the hurt. I realized that I couldn't continue down this path. I had to leave it behind, no matter how painful and difficult it would be. My feelings for Nathan had been real, but they had marked the beginning of the end. The attempt to reclaim a lost sense of life had resulted in ruin. I swiped my finger across the screen, and the message disappeared, leaving nothing but emptiness. Left alone in this house, I began to feel the crushing weight of silence. In every corner, in every room, I saw echoes of who we had been and who we might have become. These walls held the memories of our family, of what once felt solid and unchanging. But now it was just me, and this overwhelming sense of hopeless loss. I wandered through the empty rooms, and memories like shadows came to life around me. Here, in this house, I had found and lost myself. I heard faint echoes of laughter between Alex and me, memories of our plans and dreams, which had once felt so real, so attainable. I thought I had built something valuable, but it had all collapsed under the weight of my own actions. This was the ending I had feared. But now, alone, I knew that I had to start anew, leaving all of this behind. The house fell into silence, and I allowed it to embrace me, understanding that sometimes the only way forward is simply to keep moving, without looking back.